right-wing extremists. That was a very tongue-in-cheek thing that I said at the 4th of July rally when I stood before some people and we made a joke about it. Of course, people can take anything and sound with it and make it do what they want. Now, the other thing about this thing about taking up arms against the government, back in October 2009, we had a rally that was at a place called At the Revolution. And off to the side, there was a gentleman that was dressed in a Continental Army regalia, and he did have a musket, and he did have a bayonet. And before I came out to speak, there was a fight for drum corps. It was a Revolutionary War theme. And what I was talking about the metaphor of taking up the musket, taking up the ability to stand on principle for the United States of America. And I will bring you to a great quote from Thomas Jefferson, where he said, "If injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. And the means by which we resist being oppressed in this country is through the ballot box." And that's where we'll be 3 weeks from now.
I would agree that it is all about the ballot box, and that's the beauty of our democracy. But whether you want to call them rhetorical flourishes or I was in the mood at that moment, it's serious stuff. People in this country are looking for leadership. They're not looking for divisiveness. They're not looking for threats. They're not looking for intimidation. There have been a lot of comments along the way calling me names and threatening. That just doesn't have a place in this democracy. What we do need are people who are willing to stand up, work together in an optimistic view. This isn't about just tearing things down. Criticism is okay, but you have to offer constructive solutions. And I'm very confident that over the years, my reputation, whether it was working with Jeb Bush to bring Scripps Research Institute to this community, so we know it's about creating good quality jobs, or working, as I said, with a Medicare project that Republicans remind me, it's about working together and finding solutions to the problems we have in our crossroad areas.
You both called for continuing the Bush-era tax cuts for the wealthiest 2% of Americans, permanently in the case of Mr. West that cost him hundreds of billions of dollars, temporarily in the case of Mr. Klein that cost him tens of billions of dollars. How can you justify increasing the national debt to cut taxes for the wealthy?
Well, my position is the current tax system is problematic, obviously, for many reasons. But here's the bottom line. I do support keeping it in place for another year because we're in a delicate position in our recovery right now. And I want our businesses and people to know what the rules are for the next year. But this is the moment where we need to bring our businesses, our seniors, our families, who are the taxpayers together to say, what can we do to reduce our deficit and at the same time create an investment strategy that will encourage entrepreneurs and businesses to invest. I want to keep capital gains low and dividend rates low because those are strategies which require and encourage investing. I also am against this notion of every 2 years is a new tax strategy in Washington. We need a 10-year, 20-year permanent plan to say, if I'm a business and I want to create a research and development strategy, or I want to make an investment, there's a depreciation schedule I know will be in place for the long term. That's how businesses will make the right investments. Now, my opponent also has come up with another tax strategy, which I strongly disagree with, and I'd certainly like to ask him why he's doing that. He supports, and he said it over and over again, a consumption tax, which is a national sales tax of 23%. That's on every single item. You go to the supermarket, you buy milk and produce, that's an item you're going to have to pay sales tax. You go to fill up your car, that's something that you're going to have to pay for another $7, $8 in tax. To me, that is the worst kind of tax, particularly for our community. We have over 130,000 seniors in this area. Many of them only get Social Security at very minimal tax. And what that means is they will pay a huge amount of tax that they've never paid before. So you got to cut government where you need to cut, and I think we got to go line by line, and you need to make sure you have a tax strategy that in the long term will create growth and reduce the deficit.
Mr. West. Well, I think first and foremost, I've never talked about a fair tax solution. I've always talked about a flat tax solution. And that has been something I've said constantly over and over. But I think that when you look at the issue of tax cuts, I go back and look at what John F. Kennedy did. When John F. Kennedy took over, he had a 91% marginal tax rate. And he said, we must cut taxes, even if it does mean a temporary increase to the deficit, so that we can get this under control. And he brought it down 21% to 70%. You also go back and you study what Presidents Coolidge and Harding did, and taking the marginal tax rate down to 24%. But then, of course, subsequent to that, you had Hoover, and then also Roosevelt, who took it up to 83%. It is a known fact that if you cut taxes, you will increase the revenues as per the GDP. But the key thing that has to be learned along with that is something that President Bill Clinton did along with Newt Gingrich in the House of Representatives. If you're going to cut taxes, you have to cut back on on the growth of government. That was the failure of the Bush administration. You cannot have tax cuts and then have the exorbitant growth in government. I think the most important thing we have to understand is 1 year means nothing to the business cycle. It's so important that these tax rates apply to small business owners, because small business owners operate at the personal income tax level. So they need to have the certainty, they need to have the predictability so that they can grow, they can expand, and they can hire Americans, which is one of the critical things that we have to do down here in South Florida.
I wanted to just clarify something. Mr. West supports the permanent placement of the Bush tax cuts. The estimate on that is trillions, not hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars in additional debt. I can't support that. I mean, we need to cut the deficit. It has to be done in a way where we all come together to figure out the most effective way of creating jobs. The most effective way to create the deficit. The more people that have jobs, the people that pay mortgages, shop in our stores and our businesses, and they will pay taxes to help reduce the deficit. The other thing I'd like to say is Mr. West, over 10 times, and it's fully documented, has given speeches where he supports a consumption, moving toward a consumption tax that is a 23% sales tax on every single item. He said it most recently in the Palm Beach Investment Group a few weeks ago. So I think, Mr. West, you need to understand why you want to add a new tax to senior citizens at this time in our town.
And once again, I think the critical thing that Congressman Klein is taking the soundbite. What we got into the discussion is how do we have reform and change the tax reform structure that we have. I believe in the flat tax first and foremost to get us away from the progressive tax system that we have. Now the critical thing, he keeps talking about the fair tax, the consumption tax. If you're going to have that later on in life, that means all other taxation must be gotten rid of. That means the repeal of the 16th Amendment. That means that there cannot be any other taxation. But yet, you know, Mr. Klein sits up there with an administration that could come back and talk about having a value-added tax, a consumption tax that goes on top of all the taxation that we currently have already. I do not agree with that. And once again, coming back to this understanding about taxation, when taxation is low, the revenues, as per your GDP, increases. That's what we need to have. But in concert with that, we've got to cut back on the growth of government. Now, I keep hearing people on the other side say it's going to be 500 billion, 700 billion. Now he's talking about 1 trillion. They are just throwing numbers out there just the same as they threw numbers out there with the stimulus. No one understands that if you unleash the entrepreneurial spirit of our small business owners, we will restore this economy.
Third question is from Carlos Holmes, and it's first by Mr. West.
Gentlemen, after approving a nearly $800 billion stimulus plan, unemployment still remains high. Mr. Klein, what specific gains can you point at to give Americans confidence your policies will work? Mr. West, what specific policies will you propose to improve the economy?
The most specific policies I want to propose first and foremost is to reform our tax code system. As I have said and continue to say, I think the flat tax is something we go to first and foremost. 10 to 12, maybe 13% of a flat tax. And I think also when you look at our corporations and businesses, we need to cut that 33 to 35% corporate business tax rate in half. We need to flatten that out, bring it down to 16 to 17%. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to attend a barbecue lunch with TEC Corporation, which is also the holder of Power Canada. We need to bring more corporations and businesses down to South Florida, where we have all of the intangibles that would allow people to come here. But we must set the conditions. We must set the economic priorities that allow people to bring those jobs and those opportunities back to the United States of America. I do agree. Capital gains taxes should not increase. Dividends taxes should not increase. We don't need to see the marriage tax credit go away or be lessened. We don't need to see the child tax credit cut in half. We don't need to see the estate tax come back to 55% and maybe even be retroactive. The most important thing that we have to do is start to invest in American people. Invest with their investment, their ingenuity, their innovation. But coupling with that, we've got to look at all the Christmas programs we have in Washington, D.C. I don't believe in corporate spending and earmarks. I think that that has affected so much of having a good and strong financial system and fiscal responsibility in Washington, D.C. I think one of the critical things that you saw was that members of Congress who left Washington, D.C. without giving us any type of predictability or certainty in our economic situation. One of the mandates that the Constitution lays down is that Congress must establish some type of a budget. And we don't have a budget. We have a continuing resolution, which means that people are out here now in a new fiscal year, and they do not know what is going to come for them in the next subsequent